everybody. Welcome back to the show. The topic of today's episode is something that I've been thinking about for some time. I think most Catholics, any practicing Catholic, is aware of how evil communism and Marxism is, at least in its the way that it's been applied in history. Some of them might not be so sure about the theory of it. They might be ignorant as to what the problems with that are. But most people, I think, most faithful Catholics are even aware of that Marxism is basically incompatible with Catholicism. And yet, sometimes I see well-meaning Catholics, philosophers, people who are interested in political philosophy, trying to kind of rescue insights from Marx or draw insights from him. It's something that's always made me a little uneasy for a number of reasons. I think his philosophy is so corrupt, first of all, that it's hard to draw anything that's not tainted from it. But also for spiritual reasons. I think based on my knowledge of his personal life, I don't think this was somebody we can treat as a philosopher like any other who just happened to make some errors. I don't think his motives were what he said they were. I don't think he had much love for his fellow man. But also on a deeper level, after reading some works by the Protestant pastor Richard Wurmbrand, who was prison and victim of communist torture in Romanian communist prison camps, he gave some pretty compelling evidence that Marx was literally a Satanist. And I know that may seem surprising, but today's guest will take us through some of that evidence because he gives it, I think, much more of a scholarly backing than Wurmbrand did. My guest today is Paul Kengor, author of The Devil and Karl Marx, out from Tan Books. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Thank you, Thomas. It's good to be with you with such a uplifting and edifying topic.
Well, since I think we're going to focus in mainly on the early chapters of your book today, I wonder if you could start off with just an overview of kind of the whole project and the scope of the book.
Well, I guess I should start with sort of how it came about, right? I've focused on communism, socialism, the Cold War, Marxism for 30 years. I mean, going back to when I graduated from college. I was the editorial page editor of my student newspaper the year the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. So the interest goes back all the way to then into graduate school, my PhD. I focused on the Cold War, the collapse of communism, Soviet Union, Ronald Reagan, John Paul II, Margaret Thatcher, Mikhail Gorbachev, Václav Havel, Lech Walesa, all those different figures, Solidarity Movement. My first real published book after my dissertation was a book called God and Ronald Reagan, it actually split into two. I also did a book called The Crusader, Ronald Reagan and the Fall of Communism, which is about the larger collapse of communism. But the God and Ronald Reagan book led to God and George W. Bush, God and Hillary Clinton. I even did a spiritual biography of Hillary Clinton, looking specifically at, she's very much religious left, right? United Methodist Church. And I had offers to do 3 at least other sort of what the publisher was calling God and books, but basically spiritual biographies. And I've always been interested in Marx and Marx's upbringing, spiritual upbringing. Read about it for years, studied it for years, taught, lectured on it, read Marx biographies. And I certainly wasn't about to write a book called God and Karl Marx because Marx didn't believe in God. And in fact, when you read some of what Marx wrote in his poetry and plays about the devil, it'd be better called The Devil and Karl Marx. And also, too, I mean, that phrase, right? So Devil and Daniel Webster, Devil and is kind of a popular phrase. So Devil and Karl Marx, and really the book, Thomas, I say this in the beginning, it ought to be called simply The Devil and Communism because it's about communism generally. So Marxism, communist ideology. I think the book is about 470 pages. maybe about 130, 140 maybe are on Marx. The rest are on all sorts of other sordid Marxist characters. And on that issue that you mentioned, Satanism, I, I have other figures in the book who were Marxists who dabbled in the occult, some really nasty pagan stuff, who some people speculate, might have been possessed. In the case of Marx, as you said, the late pastor Richard Wurmbrand, who was tortured in Romanian prison for 14 years, he wrote a book called Tortured for Christ. He also wrote a book called Marx and Satan, and that was over 30 years ago, mid 80s. And I've read that. I've read that book. There's a lot of material, absolutely usable, quotable, insightful, crucial from that book. In many cases, he'd say, well, Marx did this or Lenin did that. And, oh, this is a classic Satanist ritual, right? The guy was a Satanist. And I would see that, Thomas, and to be blunt, I'd say, oh, I don't know, Pastor, maybe, right? But I don't know that we can say that 100%. So I'm much more careful about making any claims like that. I don't know if Marx was possessed. I don't know if Marx was a Satanist. I quote at length Robert Payne, who was probably the best biographer of Marx. He wrote a number of Marx biographies published by Simon and Schuster, New York University Press, academic presses. His 1968 biography on Marx, I think, is still the classic. He was a British professor of literature, an expert in translation, in plays, and in the arts. Very thoughtful guy. I don't think he was a conservative, a right winger, or anything religiously speaking like that. He was very, very careful. But he had a chapter in his book called "The Demons," and he said it did seem at times as if Marx was possessed. He said he had the devil's malignity and the devil's view of the world, and he did at times seem to act as if he was doing works of evil, doing works of the devil. That's almost a verbatim quote off the top of my head. If people want the exact quote, they can get the book. And that, and so there are people who say this, and I say, look, I don't know that for sure. I mean, you probably need an exorcist right there to say whether or not the guy was possessed. And some would say too that, well, a Satanist, Marx didn't believe in the supernatural, right? He was an atheist. Now, of course, I've unfortunately had to learn this and focusing on doing research on this topic. There are Satanists who apparently don't really believe in Satan, but are just, it's bizarre. It's weird.
That's what you say.
Yeah. What's that?
I said that's what they say,
That's right. Well, that's right. Yeah, that's a key point. And some of them do indeed publicly say that. And in the case of Marx, though, as I say in the book, it's very important not to overstate, right? But it's also important not to understate. And I'll run into this by a lot of scholars. They'll say, well, I don't see proof here that the guy was worshiping the devil. So, well, let's move on. Right? Well, but you've got all these writings, these poems, these plays where his first biographer, Franz Mehring, a German socialist and Marx admirer, discovered these and said to Marx's daughter, he said, whoa, right? These should not be allowed to see the light of day. This is bad, right? This is bad. And some more modern Marx biographers, hagiographers, admirers, they don't even quote this stuff. They avoid it. They avoid it like the plague because no doubt it doesn't make their guy look good. So you don't want to overstate, but you don't want to understate. And as I say in the book, several times I went back and kind of rechecked it after it's been published to see, did I really clarify this enough? There's enough there that is deeply disturbing, very troubling, and some things that are, quite literally chilling.
I should probably clarify, when I say quite possibly a Satanist, I don't necessarily mean a member of any formal organization or participating in this or that ritual, but more a matter of his general outlook, his preoccupations and obsessions, and what to be an overriding influence on his life. Although we will, as we'll get into, there is, reasons to suspect that, some more specific arrangement may have been involved. Uh, can you give a sense? You talked about this biographer Paine's impression of Marx. Tell us about the impression that people who knew him intimately had of him, the terms in which they described him often.
Yeah, and that's something too that at the very least gives pause, right? I mean, you had from phrases like from his wife, right, calling him my wicked knave, uh, his son, my dear devil, calling him phrases like that, which people like Wormbraun make a big deal of, and which his sympathetic biographers either ignore altogether or say, "Oh, this is cute," right? They don't see it as anything diabolical or symptomatic of anything deeper or darker or larger. But there's also phrases like when Engels first met him, Thomas, he wrote this weird poem, and something about poetry in these guys. It's another thing, but Engels described him as a monster of 10,000 devils, and he talked about this black man from Trier, and the word black is used there not in the sense that you would use of like color or skin color or ethnicity or anything like that,
Right.
but like a brooding presence, like a darkness who hops and jumps and leaps. He described him this really awful way, and in fact, some of the translations, the German translations of that poem, it could be monster of 10,000 demons or monster of 10,000 devils, or even a couple of other translations. His father asked him in this letter, it's a fascinating letter from March 2nd, 1837. He wants to know if this heart of his is governed by a demon, as he asked. And if so, is that demon heavenly or Faustian? Something about Faust with these guys. Marx was obsessed with Faust. Goethe's Faust, the classic drama about a Faustian bargain, and the character, the demon devil character, Mephistopheles. And people even said, people who knew him, one of his friends, Heinzen, Karl Heinzen, said that he was chanting the words of Faust. Looked at me with eyes, wet eyes like a goblin, right? Chanting the words of Faust, holding me under his spell. And one of the biographers of Marx, Francis Wien, when he deals with this section with Heinzen, he finds it like attractive, playful, kind of fun, right? And it's just amazing how two different biographers can read something, right, and see it in a completely different way, depending on whether or not you like the guy or don't like the guy. And they would say, well, you don't like the guy, Kengor. You're giving it the worst possible interpretation. No, I mean, I try on each individual case to say it could be this, it could be that. For me, it's the whole larger composite of all of that stuff
Right.
that when put together is very troubling and suggestive of some darker things. But Heinzen described him as chanting the words of Faust. Chanting the words of Faust. I mean, that's a funny phrase, isn't it? Chanting the words of Faust. And his favorite line from Faust, which is in a number of his writings, and Paine and other biographers have noted this, is where Mephistopheles says, everything that exists deserves to perish, right? Everything that exists deserves to perish. So, Thomas, if someone came up to you and me and said, hey, give me your favorite line, right? out, of, out of wherever, whatever, maybe give a scripture verse or, maybe some verse in Latin or, whatever that may be, not afraid, something like that, right? Would you say something? Yes, everything that exists deserves to perish, right? So that of all things, and I think this is probably what you're getting at when you say well, that would at least be kind of, for lack of a better word, Satanistic, right? That very that kind of wish. Everything that exists deserves to perish. And you see that in Marx's plays, right? I shall howl gigantic curses at mankind. I will smash the world to pieces, right? So that's reflective too of something that, to answer the question of Marx's father, would be more Faustian than heavenly.
It's very striking, that line, because I've always, or for a few years, I've said it seemed to me that Marx and Marxism is waging war against being. I know that seems like a grandiose statement to make, but that
No.
seems to be the case, not only against human nature, of course, predominantly waging war against God, because you can't touch God, by waging war against religion, by waging war against human nature and communities, the family and society as a whole. But yes, very very much waging war against being, and so very much in line with.
Well, that's a crucial point. It is a utterly revolutionary philosophy, and I teach in my when I lecture on political ideologies about totalitarianism, and kind of the one sort of common definition of totalitarianism is that totalitarians seek to transform human nature. And from Pope Benedict XVI to John Paul II to, on and on, different figures in the Catholic Church have said that the main problem with Marx and Marxism was an anthropological one, even more so than economic. It's lousy economics. Clearly Marx is no economist, and the man's sense of how economies work and how people interact in society is just, I can't believe that anybody takes it seriously. Hand the Communist Manifesto to any businessman or businesswoman, and they're going to say, just laugh and say, this guy has no clue of how the world. This is impossible. There's a gazillion questions here. Karl, if you're going to do that, but what about this, and this? Oh, well, it doesn't work. Non-starter. You get rid of the crazy idea. But he has his anthropology wrong. You're right. It's a kind of a war against human beings as we understand human beings to be. And if you get the question of man wrong and the human person wrong, everything else flows from that. And by the way, if you don't believe that human beings are made in the imago Dei, in the image of God, but that we just evolved from this materialistic line of apes, which is what Marx believed. And by the way, one of the reasons too why Marx and Engels were such awful racists, they're terrible views toward black people based on the evolutionary scale in their minds. But if that's your worldview, then so much else is going to flow from that's incorrect, and thus the failures of Marxist communist ideology.
My friends over at Online Great Books are about to start a new enrollment period on October 13th. If you've always wanted to study the great books, but haven't been able to get up the courage to do so on your own, this is a great way to finally do it. Online Great Books is a seminar program going through basically the whole Western canon, starting with Homer, going through, Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, Shakespeare, all that good stuff. I participated in this program for over a year, and I hope to resume my enrollment at some point. The program is designed for people who have jobs and families. It's not too much of a demand on your time. It's about 3 hours of reading per month, one seminar per month. They put you together with a great group of people. I can tell you that when I was in the program, those seminars were the highlight of my month. They have the benefit of motivating you to keep on schedule if you're not very self-motivated. I'm not always the most disciplined person myself, so I found that very helpful. I would be looking forward to the seminar so much that I would be making sure to get all my reading done in time. Oh, by the way, that sound you've been hearing is the sound of your mind expanding as you read Plato's dialogues. I should also mention that as you arrive at each new book you'll be studying, they send you a physical copy of the book, which is free, included in your subscription. Oh yeah, this is the sound of your brain waves when Socrates has just told a hilarious joke and you're so happy right now. If you want to learn more about the program, I recommend checking out episode 27 of this podcast, which was an interview with the founder of Online Great Books, Scott Hambrick. So again, their next enrollment period begins on October 13th. And if you're interested, I would recommend that you go and sign up for the waiting list, because they're going to start sending you some great materials right away, even before you actually enroll in the program. And when you do that, please use the referral link that I'll put in the show notes or video description here. If you use that link, you will get 25% off your first 3 months subscription fee, and you'll be helping us at Catholic Culture as well. Can we talk a little bit about, we're mostly focusing on Marx's personal life in this conversation, because to some extent we're assuming that people understand, our listeners understand, that the ideology as a whole is wrong. But it's worth talking about this famous line of religion being the opium of the people. And I'm particularly interested in it in light of what we were just talking about as the war against being, because you quote him as saying, the criticism of religion is the beginning of all criticism. And he called for the ruthless criticism of all that exists, which is so striking in this era of critical theory, in particular critical race theory, critical gender theory. But that word criticism, which is almost such a mild word in the context of, the history of communism, until you realize just how pervasive and as you say, revolutionary it is. A Catholic who advocates for revolution is doing so within a set sphere of values, which are being actually upheld by the act of a legitimate revolution against a tyrant. But this is revolution, absolutely speaking.
Yeah, and as you said, that with that quote, that's a letter to his friend Arnold Rouge in 1843, where he calls for not just criticism, right? The ruthless criticism of everything that exists, right? I mean, think about that.
Think how
The
arrogant that is.
ruthless criticism. Yeah, I mean, this is no mild statement from this guy, which is why when I hear people say, oh, communism's a really pretty good idea if you just read it and think about it. You haven't read it. You don't know what you're talking about. Okay. The ruthless criticism of everything that exists, right? And for people right now, they're kind of wink, wink. Oh, that's kind of fun. That's kind of, that's kind of trendy. It's kind of avant-garde. No, think about it. All right. You have your sacred cows. You're a progressive, a liberal, right? This is wrong. That's wrong. This is wrong. This is wrong. That's wrong. Marx just said we're going to criticize all of it. Everything means everything. Okay. You're going to ruthlessly criticize everything that exists. And there's lines like that throughout the manifesto. The Opiate of the Masses essay, where he says, religion is the heart of heartless conditions, the soul of a soulless world. It is the opiate of the masses. It is the sigh of the oppressed creature. And the criticism of religion, he says in that same essay, is the beginning of all criticism. In that essay, Thomas, he actually uses the word criticism or criticize 29 times. As Robert Payne says, maybe the only word that Marx uses more than criticize, and probably does use more than criticize, is abolish, right? Abolish private property. In fact, the line in the Communist Manifesto is a pretty good idea if you just think about it. Okay. The line is, the entire communist theory may be summed up in the single sentence: abolition of private property. Okay. But here comes my businessman or business person. Carl, you're going to have to kill 100 million people to do that, right? You're going to need prisons, guns, gulags. And Marx actually even says at the end of the 10-point plan, of course, despotic inroads will be necessary to do this. Of course, you're going to need despotism to eliminate all private property. But so abolition of private property, abolition of the family, exclamation mark. Even the most radical flare up of this infamous proposal of the communists. Exact words from the Communist Manifesto. Abolition of states, of societies, abolition of all religion, all morality, uses that word too. So this guy Marx was about burning down the house, and then he would stand in the middle of the house amid the burning embers and the flames, fist in the air, right? I shall howl gigantic curses at mankind, and then, only then, may we build the new world, right? May we build the world again anew. So he was beyond a revolutionary. This guy wasn't tinkering at the margins. Oh, let's just redistribute wealth and help the poor. If that's what you think Marxism is, you're profoundly ignorant, and you haven't even begun to read Marx, and you really need to educate yourself. And for any person on the kind of social justice religious left who makes a statement like that, you need to learn what you're talking about, man. You need to read up on this stuff big time, because you're really embarrassing yourself, and you're really supporting something that, as our church has said since at least 1846, Qui Pluribus by Pius IX, published 2 years before the Communist Manifesto was published. I mean, this is something, this is an ideology, a philosophy of despair, destruction. And as the church would say in Divini Redemptoris in 1937, the church argued that quote, this is called Marxism, called communism, a satanic scourge orchestrated by the sons of darkness, and even said the what we're fighting here is something of the spiritual order, the spiritual order. So the Roman Catholic Church actually saw it as that, which is why when a magazine like America, the leading Jesuit publication in the United States, publishes in July 2019 an article called The Catholic Case for Communism, I'm just speechless. I don't even, that makes me feel like, wow, have we failed? Wow.
You already talked about Marx's obsession with Faust and his some of his plays. Is there anything else we should say about his sort of creative literary output in his early life?
Oh man, there's so much. I don't know where to begin and where to end. I start the book
Any other
with two
major
of his
themes?
plays. Yeah, I mean the one the one poem, the one stanza that I quote at the start of the book, that I think is really insightful. I think you could argue that even if he wasn't saying it as such, that it's in a way autobiographical. He said, "Thus heaven I forfeited, I know it full well. My soul, once true to God, is chosen for hell." Note the word chosen of all things, right? But with Marx, I said it could be autobiographical. I don't know, but it's partly autobiographical because his soul was once true to God. He was he was baptized a Christian, as was his father, and baptized in, maybe the most Catholic city in all of Germany, Trier, in the literal shadow of the great cathedral of Trier. He was baptized into the Lutheran faith, as was his father. By the way, he credited Martin Luther mightily, saying that the revolution that began in the brain of the monk now begins in the mind of the philosopher.
Hmm.
And his point there, a reader at National Review, a reviewer at National Review, zinged me for this, saying that I'm blaming Martin Luther for communism. And I say explicitly in the intro of that section that I'm not, because I knew that some people would have that kind of a knee jerk reaction. But what Marx is saying there, because Luther, of course, would never have supported Marxism, right, or Marx. But what Marx is saying there is that Luther, in this long dialectical march of history that Marx believed in, provided a crucial break from Rome, from the authority of Rome. And that break from Rome, allowing the individual his or her own interpretation of religion, of scripture, and in Marx's case, morality, truth itself. In Marx's view, that was a crucial step along the transitionary process that allowed Marx to do what he did. So that's something that has not been appreciated enough. But Marx actually wrote that, and that too is I think it's in the Opiate of the Masses essay. Uh, and one more example, there's a truly chilling play that I spend a lot of time on called Ulanem. It's Oulanem, Oulanem, Ulanem, which both Wormbrand and Paine say is an anagram for Emmanuel. So almost like an aping of God, right? So where Gabriel, the messenger angel Gabriel, says to Mary, "You shall bear a child; his name shall be Emmanuel. He shall be the Son of the Most High." And the Ulanem character, who's like a mock creator kind of character, who in the end, destroys everything. And Paine says that you need to understand that Ulanem is Marx as judge and executioner. Wormbrand says that Ulanem is a Satanist anagram for Emmanuel, and that was one of those things too, Thomas, where I thought, well, I don't know, Wormbrand, do you really know that? And when I Googled Ulanem, you don't you don't want to Google Ulanem, all right? You might want to splash some holy water on your laptop before you do that. You're going to get all kinds of Satanist images that pop up on your website. It's ugly, and you will get a Wikipedia reference too that notes that it was a play by Marx. But it's here again. I don't know if it's a directly, literally intended Satanist anagram by Marx or what, but it's a very troubling symptom of whatever it was that Marx was into.
We're going to talk about the way he treated people around him, especially his family in general. But first, let's talk about that in connection with this spiritual and possibly satanic stuff. Well, you mentioned his obsession with Faust, a story about a man who makes a pact with or sells his soul to the devil, and in order to gain power. And I think in all the versions of the story that I know of, that's basically his motivation. He also there was also I forget if maybe I'm remembering the book wrong, but I think he had a preoccupation with suicide pacts, or if not, that was at least something that manifested itself in the life of a number of his children. Was that something that came up in his literature as well, or was that just something that happened in his life?
Yeah, his plays, his poetic works are. By the way, he fancied himself a poet. I mean, he wanted to be a poet, and that was kind of his love, his hidden love. So, which is why again you can't ignore this stuff. He actually published poetry in some journals, and a lot of it was written when he was younger. Yes, but Marxist sympathizers, progressives who like him, if you're gonna do dramas and films like The Young Marx, okay, celebrating, elevating, cheering on, heralding the young Marx, then you can't ignore this stuff from the life of young Marx. And also beyond that, he was writing this stuff when, in some cases, when he did his dissertation, same decade that he wrote the Communist Manifesto. But the plays are rife with darkness, the pale maiden, right? See this sword, the prince of darkness sold it to me, right? This sword, this blood dark sword shall stab erringly within thy soul, right? That's his 1841 poem that I put at the front of the book. They suicide pacts. The two lovers go off together and take suicide. They take poison. Come with me, my darling, down below. Right? Horrible stuff. And yet, here's why I think some of the stuff really matters. Is in so many ways where the private, the whatever, the poetic becomes the personal in Marx. Marx had two daughters who committed suicide in suicide pacts with their husbands by drinking poison. Okay. Um, and so, here again, I could see the Marx defender, right? Are you saying that they read one of Marx's plays? No, I don't know. But I mean, can you name another figure for me in all of human history who had two daughters who killed themselves in suicide pacts with their husbands by drinking poison? And the father wrote plays about suicide pacts? I mean, come on, guys, right? I didn't see any of this in God and Hillary Clinton. All right, I didn't see any of this in God and George W. Bush. Yeah, this is bizarre, weird, sick stuff. By the way, of the two daughters, one of them, the one who was married to Edward Aveling, who himself was like a junior Marx, socialist, scoundrel, cheated on his wife, refused to work, leached off of everybody else, sponged money off of everybody else, a moocher like Marx the moocher. He backed out of the suicide pact after he gave Eleanor the poison. And some people thought that he should have been tried for murder, which he probably should have. The other suicide pact that included Marx's son-in-law Paul Lafargue, who was partly Cuban. So according to Marx, that meant that he was partly Negro. And there's a letter between him and Engels where they're trying to deduce how much quote unquote N-word blood Paul has in him, either 1/8 or 1/12, and they're marveling over his cranial size and comparing it to the race of Negroes and comparing it to apes, all kinds of horrible stuff. So Marx's view of his son-in-law, who he called Negrillo or the gorilla, needless to say, the son-in-law probably had pretty low self-esteem. All of which, Thomas, you would think would get a figure canceled by the champions of our cancel culture today, but not Karl Marx, right? He's he's somebody that we should like. Professors, put busts of Karl Marx in your office, right? Kind of like Margaret Sanger. Spoke to the Silver Lake, New Jersey chapter of the KKK in May 1926. Right here in your 1938 Houghton Mifflin biography, pages 366, 367. We'll look the other way, right? Amazing what they can get away with.
What about the bedtime story that he told to his children? Going back to the Faust theme.
Oh, the Hans Rockel story. Yeah, you're the first person to ask me about that. I'm surprised that no one else has. And his daughters talk about this, that they would walk on Sunday morning to Hampstead Heath in London, and the father would tell them the story about this toy maker named Hans Rockel, who had this enchanted toy shop with all kinds of enchanting little figures, right? Dwarves and kings and queens and all these other things. And he had made this pact as well, where he sold his soul. He owed something to the devil, and the daughters said that the way that their father told this story and almost shouted it as they walked used to terrify them. They said it was more terrifying than the stories of, I'm trying to think what the guy's name was. He's not E.F.H. Hoffman, is that the right word? He was kind of like Stephen King of the day, and they said that these stories were even more scary than some of the Hoffman thrillers of the day. Payne too focuses on this, and he thinks that Hans Rockel in this case might be another example of almost autobiography by Marx, where Marx himself is that person. And here again, another case you say, I don't know for sure if that's the case, but you add up that and that and that and that and that, and then you have all these different things. You look at them all together, and you say, can we at least agree that this is pretty disturbing, right? It is.
Before we get off of the direct connection to things demonic, I unfortunately didn't have time to read the entire book. I read about the first 140 pages of it, and skimmed through portions of the rest of it. But one thing, I think the first time I opened it up and flipped through it, I came upon a part where you talk about Walter Duranty, the
Oh,
gosh, what was the name of the movie that was just made about that?
yeah, I haven't seen it yet. Mr. Jones or something like
So
that.
Walter Duranty was his New York Times journalist who won a Pulitzer, I believe, for his work basically shilling for the Soviet Union and portraying it as a workers' paradise, and was later shown to be a complete fraud. He actually is known to have done sexual black magic stuff with the famous, very influential occultist Aleister Crowley. And in fact,
Yeah.
at one point, Crowley was wondering if he could continue down this path of the occult, and he ran into Duranty, and Duranty was the one who kind of confirmed him in continuing down that path. So I don't know, we don't even need to say anything more about that, but that was kind of that, I guess that's a sample of the rest of the book, as far as some of the
You use the word sample. Yeah, they exchanged their semen samples among one another in this kind of pagan, ritualistic, sexual, occult thing where they were sharing a woman in a threesome. Her name was Jane Sharon, French woman. And I think Crowley said, who called himself the wickedest man in the world, liked her, considered her maybe the wickedest woman in the world. And it's interesting, this is all in S.J. Taylor's classic book on Duranty, which I think was published by Oxford University Press.
yeah,
And that's the
some
book,
website
Walter.
Illuminati or something.
Yeah, yeah. Walter Duranty, the New York Times man in Moscow. He also denied the Ukrainian famine, said that it wasn't happening, or at least not in the way that people thought it was, or as bad as people thought that it was. And some say he didn't just deny it, but he actually lied about it. That he knew about it, he helped cover it up. He was being wined and dined by the Soviets. Meanwhile, while he had his own kind of live-in mistress, maid, who was catering to Duranty's sexual needs, not unlike Marx, whose family live-in maid, housemaid Lenchen, who was Marx got her pregnant behind his wife's back, and the child, he denied the existence of the child, refused to pay the child any money, even a penny of child support. But then again, they didn't pay Lenchen either. She was like an indentured servant to the Marx family. So much for the champion of the proletariat. But Duranty and Aleister Crowley, yeah, this is an S.J. Taylor's biography, Thomas, and everybody's either missed it or didn't talk about it. And I quote from that and elsewhere, other sources in that chapter. Wait till people read that. That is really perverse, sick. And I mean, they were engaging in some of the weirdest cultish, occult, at least pagan, sexual practices and rituals that are beyond bizarre. I don't care who you are. You read that part of the book, and you're going to say, "Oh man, these guys were really weird, really creepy." And they're not the only ones. The only communists. Crowley's view on communism is actually complex, but Duranty, Walter Benjamin, Kate Millett, so many others who were really into some dark, strange stuff.
Can we wrap up by talking about less Marx's spiritual affiliations or lack thereof, and more his personal behavior? First of all, his hypocrisy regarding money, and secondly, how he treated his family and friends, especially in matters of money.
Yeah, the way he treated his family, I mean, he could not put a roof over their heads. The only way that they got a roof over their heads was from Marx's family's inheritance and the father. And then when the father died, and Marx didn't go to the father's funeral, some Marx biographers say that he couldn't or whatever, couldn't make it, and others say no, he did it out of spite. I don't know. I quote from both, but he seemed to love his father, although a um, very difficult relationship with his father. After the father died, he went to the mother to try to bilk the mother for money. And he even writes some letters to his wife, Jenny, on basically how, well, at least I got one thing from the old hag. That's my life, right? At least I got an IOU that she would give me some more money. And at one point, the mother had to cut him off too, even though she knew that the money was keeping the Marx family alive. Tough love. Marx's mother, like his wife's, both expressed the wish that Karl would start earning some capital rather than just writing about capital. Then they went to Jenny's family, his wife's family. Yeah, she would go off begging. I quote some of the notes from her. Oh, Karl, stop. I am in such a state. The butcher is a terrifying man. He's coming after us. We owe him money. And he's not even as scary as the landlady who's going to bang the door down and throw us out. Meanwhile, he's drinking the money away, not earning anything. And they would have gone completely broke if it wasn't for Engels, actually, if it wasn't for Engels' capitalist father, which is where Engels got all the money. And Engels was Marx's top subsidizer, sap, and sugar daddy. He bailed out Marx at every turn. In fact, he even accepted paternity for Marx's illegitimate child when Marx denied that Marx was the father. They named the kid Freddie after Engels, and Engels did that in part to save Marx's marriage. Engels didn't believe in marriage, right? He and Marx both wrote against it, and Marx even wrote to Engels, "Blessed is he who has no family." And Marx would tell one of his son-in-laws, I think it was Paul, that oh, I don't know why any fool would even want to get married, right? Of course, Marx didn't want Paul to marry his daughter because Marx was part, because Paul was part N-word, as Marx put it. So they, but yeah. So Engels didn't care about his reputation, right? It was fine with him if people thought that Freddie was his illegitimate child. Blah, who cares? Marriage? Ha ha! Who cares about marriage? Blessed is he who has no family, said Marx. So they, but it was Engels. It was his chief subsidizer, and the family, probably even at least one of the children, arguably died from Marx's refusal to really keep the family safe and warm. And Paul Johnson, the British historian who does not like Marx at all, and any Marxist historian or progressive, you cover your ears now, right? Johnson's a conservative. I don't want to hear what he has to say. Johnson said that Jenny's affections for Marx never recovered after the loss of that particular child, and she blamed him in part for the death because of the family's woeful financial situation. Marx wrote to Engels, "Not a day goes by that my wife doesn't wish that she was in her grave with the children, such is her misery." So he was a terrible family man. And Thomas, I've written on this a number of times in a number of Q&As, including at Catholic websites. And Catholics will go to the reader comments and say, "Why is this relevant? Why are we talking about the guy's personal life?" Well, haven't you figured it out? Right? The private was public in Marx's case, right? What he advocated are extensions of all of this private behavior.
Right.
And in a nearly 500-page book, it's okay if it's a biography to talk about this for 12 pages, okay? And then if an interviewer asks you about it, that's okay too. All right. So take it easy, quit huffing and puffing. This stuff is relevant, right? In Marx's case, the private stuff is very relevant to his worldview and his philosophy and what he wanted for the world. What Marx's ideal system, Thomas, would have been one where Marx could have lived the life that he lived, refusing to work, refusing to literally get his butt up off the couch, which is one of the reasons he had carbuncles all over his bottom all the time, where the rest of the world would subsidize him so he could criticize and shout abolition. That would have been Marx's ideal world. And in the kind of Marxist collectivist nanny state that he envisioned, that's probably what he was angling for. Although, frankly, the people that ran such a state probably would not have put up with Karl Marx.
just to touch on what you just said there, it's kind of embarrassing that Catholics would say, "Well, how is that relevant?" I mean, this separation of philosophy from one's personal life is just a modern invention. I mean, philosophy means the love of
Yeah,
wisdom. The ancient philosophers considered philosophy to be a way of life. And also, we're not talking about a science that has no bearing on, that has no direct connection to morality, like chemistry or something like that. Not that it could be totally
precisely.
discounted in terms of one's wider philosophy, but these things affect how we think, and it's a good thing for moderns that they've convinced people that one's personal life is irrelevant to the quality of one's philosophy,
Right.
because just about any modern philosopher you look at, you can find problems with their personal life. Certainly,
Yeah, in fact, Paul Johnson's book Intellectuals was filled with examples like that, which is why he has one chapter on Marx that deals with all those things. And as a case in point of what I'm talking about, go to the Q&A that I did with Catholic World Report and look at the reader comments. It's stunning. And go to some of the reader comments in an op-ed piece I wrote for National Catholic Register, where one person says, "Oh, Kengor is quoting of Marx referring to the social principles of Christianity as cowardice, hypocritical, and everything else. This is out of context. He's talking about Marx is actually talking about kings and whatever else. Yeah, but it's not out of context. He says what he says, and then he makes a categorical statement, right? The social principles of Christianity are base, they are cowardice, they are hypocritical. He doesn't stop and say, in this case, these people show that in some cases, individuals who are Christians can be whatever, whatever. I had a review, a national review, some of these same points, and I don't get it. When even people on our side fail to make kind of obvious connections on this stuff, I look at this and I say, wow, I see why we're losing. And let me give one more example. I have a section on Kate Millett in the book, and you haven't gotten there yet. Wait till you read this. You'll probably, when this interview is over, you'll probably go straight to that section. She was called the Mao Zedong of the women's movement by Time magazine. She was on the cover of Time. She wrote the book Sexual Politics. And I quote her sister Mallory at great length. And Mallory is now a very devout Catholic. And Mallory says that Kate was not only deeply disturbed and crazy, Mallory believes that Kate was possessed and has said so a bunch of times.
right.
And in her case, she believes that Kate's philosophy and kind of miserable view and her thinking all grew out of not necessarily possession, but out of this kind of really dark, twisted worldview. She would say to me, Thomas, she'd say, if only people reading my sister's book knew what my sister was really like, they would not be taking her seriously. And I found in a number of things, a book needs to be written on this. Many of the people that are out there with ideas that some people follow, or that people even follow online or wherever, are not well. It's remarkable how people, if they only really knew the character and beliefs and the behavior of the people that they were signing up to follow their credo, their ideology, if they could only really see what they were like in real life, they'd say, why am I listening to this person? Right? And in our cases, me and you, I mean, we follow the teachings of Jesus. All right, not a fair comparison, right? Perfect human being, 100% God, 100% man. Well, we follow the words of the Blessed Mother. Catholics believe Immaculate Conception, not another perfect example. Okay, every night before I go to bed, I read about different saints, right? I draw inspiration from saints, St. Francis, Catherine of Siena, Faustina. When you read what these people were like and the sacrifices they made, those are inspiring examples who really practiced what they preached, lived out what their lives were really like. So this stuff matters. And when you read about Marx and you see the philosophy as indeed an extension of the private, then you will have no doubt that that it's very, very relevant and should not be dismissed.
Also, just to go back to what you mentioned before about people who dismiss the relevance of Marx's poems and plays and early writings as sort of juvenilia, aside from what you pointed out about the time frame in which they were written being not that far apart from some of his major canonical writings on communism, this is a kind of a pet peeve of mine. I think Catholics shouldn't believe in the idea of it's just a phase. What you do in your formative years, if not corrected, it forms you. That's why they're called your formative years. And it actually
Amen.
that goes quadruple for anything involving the occult or magic or Satanism or anything like that. That stuff, unless specifically repudiated and healed, stays with you. It becomes part of you in some way. And people think that oh well, my sleeping around, that was just a phase. It's like, okay, you might have stopped doing that, but you didn't repent it, and that means, I'm willing to bet that means, whatever pathology was involved in that is now just manifesting itself in a different way than it was back then. So there's the kind of the truism about, when they're young, they're crazy with lust, and when they're older, they get greedy or whatever. But this is just terribly naive and stupid to think that these things don't have a significant relevance for one's later life. I mean, uh,
Well,
in this
that's
case,
right.
it's not even that far apart.
Right. I mean, I was a rotten piece of garbage. I mean, I wake up in the middle of the night sometimes and I think to myself, oh man, I can't believe I did that. Oh, I forgot about that. Right. I can't believe I said that. I can't believe I said those things. I can't believe those beliefs. I mean, I'm doing penance, on and on and on and on for things that I did and said, even into my college years. And, I've had people come up to me today and say, wow, what happened? How did you change so much? And it's like, well, I had a conversion. I became a Christian. Uh, and all the spiritual biographies I've done, Hillary Clinton, George W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, I spend 50, 60, 70 pages in those formative years. And by the way, no one ever says, well, why did you include the stuff from their youth in this case, right? So now they just do it when you include it on Marx and it's bad. Right? You're using this to discredit his beliefs. No, it's the elephant in the living room of his life and helps explain his beliefs and even how you go from A to B to C to D. So yeah, this stuff is very, very relevant.
Just before we go, this one more thing occurs to me. Just a pedantic retort I get even from some Catholics on, if you describe a current movement as being Marxist in some way, they'll say, well, okay, Jordan Peterson may not be, completely accurate on everything, but people would say to him, well, you can't talk about, postmodern neo-Marxists because historically, the postmodernists and the Marxists are opposed. And it's like, yeah, but
Yeah,
first of all, he's not saying they're doctrinaire orthodox Marxists.
right.
However many of those really existed in history, I don't know. But it's more, I mean, these are confused mishmash ideologies being mixed together for one thing, but also,
Yeah,
it's not that they're doctrinaire Marxists, it's that aspects of these ideologies are identifiably, I like to use the word, and I think I got this from Rothbard because I used to be a libertarian and read him. Marxian, I think, is a great word to describe it, because it doesn't mean that they're Marxist in a systematic way, but it means that identifiable features of the thought are from Marx. So the example I always give is Marx had this idea of class consciousness, which is diabolical in the literal sense of being divisive, because it says that anybody's thinking is determined by the interests of the class that they belong to. And if you come up with a counterexample, that just means that person has false consciousness, meaning that, essentially, if a black person in the modern day doesn't think that the way they're supposed to, they're an Uncle Tom. That would be kind of like a modern application of it. And this kind of denies the universality of reason and prevents anybody from communicating with anybody else really in any other language except for power. And this is clearly reflected and amplified and applied far beyond class in intersectionality, where everything is an expression of your privilege or of whatever else can be said about the category you supposedly belong to. And that's an identifiably Marxian idea. So I think it's really missing the point to say, oh, well, technically, in an academic level, that's not Marxism.
Yeah, the word Marxian is quite good. That's a very good point. And I know we got to wrap up. But I'll hit this point. I think I spent a lot of time toward the end of the book talking about all of that, especially when we get to the Frankfurt School, Freudian Marxists, gender Marxists, right? Sexual Marxists. Today the word cultural Marxist gets flagged by Google and Southern Poverty Law Center and these other groups. But I mean, it was just crazy that it does, because I mean, of course there are Marxists in culture. I mean, they're applying their Marxism to culture. Read the literature, read the books, man. If you guys need help, Southern Poverty Law Center. I'm serious. This is an olive branch. Okay, email me. I will help you with this stuff. I'll show you the literature. No name calling. I don't want any money. I'll tell you who the bad guys are too, who abuse it. I'm happy to do that, right? There are Freudian Marxists. Wilhelm Reich, who wrote the book The Sexual Revolution, was a Freudian Marxist. But that phrase, critical theory, everybody who studies critical theory learns about Marx. And I mean, just go to the website of any of these departments to do it. And it's what and I think maybe the most important word there, connection with Marxism, is the word critical, like we said at the start of this interview, right? It's about being critical. And Marx was nothing if not critical. Everything that exists deserves to perish. The ruthless criticism of all that exists. So there's a very important commonality there with Marx. And as you'll see in those movements today, that's the most important thing, not whether or not they're talking about a proletariat, right? They're beyond that. They're not even thinking of proletariat. They're not looking at the factory floor of the West Virginia coal miner. Go to the website of People's World, which is the successor to the Daily Worker. Read the About section. They issue a call for cultural workers. Cultural workers. That's the vineyard that they're looking in right now, the culture. To quote the famous assessment of Gramsci's thought, the long march through the institutions, right? But alas, maybe we could save that topic for another day.
Well, Paul, I really appreciate your time coming on the show, and I'm looking forward to finishing the book on my own time and learning about all these further connections down the line as Marxism was implemented. And thank you for the work you've done here and for backing it up so much with footnotes. I think that's really essential when anything you say on such a topic is going to be looked at so critically.
Well, sure thing, and have an absolute lovely time reading the rest of this book. It's just so much fun.
All right, God bless.
You too. Thank you, Thomas.